Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk. How is that? Is this distance okay? Can you guys hear me all right? Awesome. So as you can see by the title, this talk is going to be about documents, very OSINT heavy, talking a lot about data leakage, document leakage, and document metadata. Now, if you were here for the opening remarks, that was my cell phone that went off really loud. So as punishment, if anyone wants to play a ringtone really loud at any point during my talk, that is well-deserved and welcomed. So a little bit about who I am. I'm Nick Ascoli. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called Foretrace. We're an external attack surface management product. Formerly, I was a senior cyber research scientist with a company called Security Risk Advisors. I've made some open source tools, all very OSINT-y, and I've spoken at a bunch of conferences. And if you'd like to talk or want to chat about this kind of stuff, that's my contact information. I'm pretty new to Twitter, so don't expect much over there. Now, equally as important to this topic is who I am not. First and foremost, I am not a plumber. Though I have been known to find some leaky buckets, I cannot be trusted with anything blue collar beyond putting together IKEA furniture. I'm also not a lawyer. While this is a strange disclaimer to have to give for a talk like this, the legalities of accessing someone else's documents from the public internet is messy at best. There's not a lot of litigation beyond a couple small examples I'll talk about, but we're going to be talking a lot about Google dorking, finding documents on the internet from the comfort of your own home, and the legality around viewing those files. In short, I do not endorse viewing someone else's files without their permission. However, it's very easy to do. Now, this slide you might find offensive due to its simplicity, but when I'm talking about documents in this talk specifically, these are the kinds I'm talking about. The file types that spin the cogs of the world of business. These are the files that we interact with. These are typically the file types we're trying to protect as enterprise defenders from getting out. These are the files that store everything that a business is doing. Now, in terms of publication, I break publication down into two categories. The least common one is intentional. This is, releasing marketing collateral, releasing product documentation as a company, releasing press releases, anything where you're posting a PDF, a Word doc, a spreadsheet, a publicly accessible SharePoint URL to the internet, which is typically linked to the corporate domain. What I'm more interested in and find a lot more common is unintentional. So while these can also be linked directly to the corporate domain via like a misconfigured IIS server or collaboration software that's been shared via URL, these are documents which have been published to the internet. And what I'm considering publication is it's available via a public URL and it's been indexed by a search engine. So Google or Bing has picked up the URL to this file, whether it's downloadable, whether it's accessible in browser, and made it so that someone from the outside with the link can view it. There's a lot of reasons for this that I see regularly, and this is anecdotal. There's a lot of other reasons, but collaboration softwares, particularly SharePoint, OneDrive, and G Suite, making files shareable via URL. This is the biggest culprit for very, very internal files accidentally getting indexed by Google because they are hosted when you visit the files from the public on live.officeapps.com or something. Those links are being indexed by search engines all the time. So accidentally making a file shareable via URL or intentionally doing it to share it with consultants is going to make it public-facing in many cases. Internal document storage misconfigurations. So if you're working in like a lab or a manufacturing environment, there's all kinds of very good uses for document metadata and document repository storage that is required for compliance with a bunch of stuff. And those servers often we find misconfigured, accidentally exposed to the internet, and then the obvious stuff, misconfigured Git repos, leaky buckets, all that good stuff. And before we get into the technical side, a little story time. This is why I gave the legal disclaimer. So there was a gentleman, Robert Hutchinson, a climate activist in London, who was doing some research on a big evil company, big developer who was going to tear down some playgrounds in his community. This is a true story. Robert was Googling the company, found their internal note-taking software online, took a screenshot of the notes he found within it, which had some interesting info about them, like, I don't know, bribing or, trying to influence people in the community to vote for what they were doing. And he shared those notes via Twitter. The next morning, his door gets kicked in. The Met Police cybercrime unit has taken him into custody. You'd think they'd do some due diligence to see if there was actually a crime here because they were the cybercrime task force, but no, they did not. So after a brief investigation, like 6 hours, Robert is released because the Metropolitan Police Cybercrime Unit determined that because those files, which they were internal, like these are internal corporate notes, they are proprietary, they are confidential, but because a search engine indexed them, they were considered a part of the public domain after that. So how does that apply to classified information? How does that apply to, all kinds of internal marked documents? Who the hell knows? No one knows. Like this is one of the only examples of actual litigation we have, which is why I call intent to publicize, whatever intentional or unintentional, it doesn't really matter. Once it's out there, it's a part of the public domain, and enforcing some kind of legal action against someone who's got their hands on it is going to be pretty difficult. Now, those logos at the bottom are all examples of companies who've had similar issues, whether it's from third parties accidentally leaking buckets, third parties with note-taking software that became publicly exposed, the company themselves accidentally exposing an entire SharePoint directory, which exposes all the files within, which then become indexed by Google and very easy to access. There's really no shortage of examples in recent history of this being very problematic. So how do we find corporate documents? I'm sure most of you are familiar with Google Dorks. They're super, super easy to do. Basically, what a Google Dork is using Google's pseudo-advanced search syntax to narrow down your search results to very specific things. So in the examples I'm showing here, we're looking for specific file types associated with a domain. In that first one, you can use wildcards in these searches too. So in the first one, I'm saying in the URL that I'm looking for in the search result, I want the word admin to be there. The file type that the URL is pointing to, I want it to be a spreadsheet. And the site is gov.anything, which the first is gov.ng. There's a bunch of other interesting ones. All those files, by the way, were absolutely not supposed to be exposed to the internet. Super fun search. Every example I have going down is other examples pointing at different corporate entities, but specifying what I want to see in the text. So I'm saying in the second search, site blank.com, show me docx, so show me document files with the word proprietary in the file, because Google has indexed the contents of the files as well. It's not just indexing HTML pages, it's indexing the text within the files that it finds also. And the last search, of course, it would be very crass to call out, the wonderful venue that's hosted us, but the name of that entity rhymes with Schmeriton Schmotels. If you plug in their site with PDF and in-text proprietary, it comes up with all kinds of things that are tagged confidential proprietary, not for public release, all that kind of stuff. And ExploitDB is these are really simple dorks, which find super juicy stuff. Now, if you want to find even juicier stuff, ExploitDB has a Google hacking database filled with dorks. The most fun category, for me at least, is files containing juicy info. So this is how to search specifically for file types that have been exposed by certain types of software that are sitting on the internet. And again, I do not condone viewing these files without permission of the owner. So this is something we're going to come back to a few times, but the adversarial value of a document, we're going to talk about metadata and contents. Now, talking about metadata specifically, what I mean when I say metadata are the properties attached to a file that are really only used in an advanced way by the sort of lab software I was talking about. So like in a manufacturing environment, you've got heavy FIM on these files, you've got people editing them that have super important pharmaceutical contents in them. It's very important to track that metadata. That's a good reason for file metadata to exist. Beyond that, releasing files with metadata attached, especially to the public, is not super necessary. But when I'm talking about metadata, I'm talking about the things in the file that show how this file was made, who made it, when it was made, and we'll get into the specific properties in a second. Contents I don't even need to explain. That's just what's in the file. So talking about metadata, extraction of metadata from a file is easiest done using EXIFTool. There's a couple different iterations of this in different languages, but EXIFTool is by far the gold standard in metadata extraction. You can extract, they've got a command line and a GUI version for Windows, but the command line version is much more popular, and you can extract metadata from roughly 200 file types. So in this example, I'm pulling the metadata out of a JPEG. That's literally the command. You install the utility, EXIFTool, point it to the file, it will pull down everything. And there's so much metadata associated with the file, I just cut it out. In the second example, I'm grepping just show me the key value pairs that have GPS in the field. So this is showing me, as an example for a JPEG file, with most smartphones, most digital cameras are recording GPS information about the photo. This is certainly not news. This is like in the wild, this is probably what you'll see metadata used for most, and EXIF tool used for most, is reporting on OSINT tracking via geodata stored in photos. So we've got like latitudinal and longitudinal locations of the photo taken, its location above sea level, very, very specific pieces of metadata can be contained within a file. But what we're talking about is office productivity file types. So using EXIF tool, you can do the same thing. You can run it against any kind of file. What we're looking at here, and these are files that I pulled this week. I presented them in a little more of an easy to digest way, but PowerPoint, a Word document exported to a PDF, and then a regular old PDF. So there's a lot of interesting things that EXIF tool is pulling out of the file metadata here that I'd like to point out. First of all, when pulling these files, what I'm most often finding in the author fields is either actual Active Directory credentials, so internal credentials, which is very valuable to an adversary. A lot of them have first and last name combos. Not super, that's not really that interesting. It gives me the name of someone on the inside, but like an AD credential or any sort of IDP credential is a lot more valuable because I can take that, brute force the subdomains and start poking into things that don't accept emails but only accept actual usernames. So in that document in the middle, we've got an Active Directory username in the metadata of a Word document. We've got the timestamp that the document was created, and the only reason that's interesting is because we've got a software version below of the tool that created it. And it's an outdated version. It's Adobe Acrobat Pro from 2017, which we can see at the tail end of 2021 is still running on this host. So really the value in that and the value that we piece together from a lot of documents is we can start to put together an inventory of software. The more often we see a piece of software reoccurring in a company's public documents, intentional or otherwise, the better chance we have at putting together an internal inventory of like what is probably on the gold image of most of these laptops, which makes building a payload, you've got a much higher degree of confidence when building a payload. Some of these, some documents you'll pull EXIF from will have down to the DLL used to produce that document. So you've got a DLL that you can, potentially hook or do something interesting to. Now, some other fun point outs here are in both of these, we've got confidential markings, and these are documents I pulled from the internet with very basic Google Dorks. These are probably CASB tools or DLP tools tagging these documents as confidential as they're perusing internal resources, as they're picked up, by the sensors as they're flying around, but they're still making it onto the internet despite a CASB tool or a DLP tool tagging it and probably trying to prevent its publication online due to some misconfiguration. Both of these documents contain confidential information and were specifically tagged as confidential, but were sitting with a publicly available Google indexed URL online. And they've all got interesting tags, which you can also use the tags to put together what security suites, like what security suite uses this kind of tagging infrastructure. So you can put together, again, a good idea of software versions and types running on the inside in addition to usernames and a bunch of other stuff. A file I looked at yesterday had like an employee's name and their manager in the PDF's metadata. I don't know why products do it that way. But a couple open source scripts to get started in looking at the metadata of your own organization or of whoever the hell you want is PyMeta and PowerMeta. The only difference between the two, PyMeta is a little more maintained and is written in Python. PowerMeta is in PowerShell, so depending on your environment, you can get up and running with one of these really quickly. What both of them do is dork Google and Bing for files, pull them all down, extract the metadata with EXIF tool, and put all the files in a directory for you. So I encourage you to check those out. So to conclude on metadata alone, what we've just looked at, what is the adversarial value of metadata? A few things. One is an internal inventory of usernames and conventions, so sometimes host naming conventions, sometimes OS versions. An inventory of internal software, so we can start to put together, depending on how many documents, a pretty confident gold image of what this enterprise might be running on the inside. Like it's super easy from the outside to poke at the vanity domain and see what software is running on the outside. So like maybe we can tell they're using Salesforce, but now we can tell what's going on the actual hosts running inside the company. And then obviously the identification of tagged confidential content, which is really only something I've seen in the last couple years. with the adoption of CASB and the slow death of DLP, traditional DLP, is tagged confidential documents making their way onto the internet despite protection. So talking about document contents, I'm going to show you some cool dork examples. Again, stupid, simple dorks that yield incredibly interesting results. And I'll get a little more specific with each one on how you can narrow down what you're looking for. But the most interesting takeaway, like back in 2007, when most metadata, document metadata research was done, a Google dork is probably going to show you things linked directly to the parent domain of the company. In this example, I am dorking a .gov domain looking for file type XLSX. What I'm given is a blank state police spreadsheet. I click on it, and it takes me to SharePoint. So the reason that's happening, despite the fact that you would think I would have to do site view.officeapps.live.com, show me spreadsheets, I've blurred it out so it's kind of hard to see, but that second blue box in the Office Apps URL, so this is a document shared via OneDrive or SharePoint, is the tenant name for this particular file. So Google is smart enough to know this file is associated with this domain because it's in the tenant location in the URL. So now exposed SharePoint files are accidentally, despite not being on your domain actually, are associated with your domain in the public and dorkable. So that's super bad news. This example is, it gave me some Defense Logistics Agency report of transfers from the Defense Logistics Agency to some law enforcement offices that I've blurred out. And it's pretty boring stuff, air conditioners, bench presses, but there was some cool stuff in there like rucksacks and body armor. And I'm sure the more I scrolled through results, the more I would have found more interesting logistical information. But another example is getting a little more specific with terms and just how easy it is. This was the first search I ran while making this presentation, and it immediately came up with good results. So this was an internal, this was not like something hosted on their vanity. This was something hosted on the vanity domain kind of, but through a backend application that they use to share presentations internally. So running this dork against this particular company, I'm just saying site companyname.com, file type PDF, and in the text of the PDF, I want to see the word confidential. So the first link, immediately business confidential, I click on it, super internal PowerPoint that is absolutely tagged on every slide, business confidential. And you can see in all the other files, I'm getting the same kind of internal markers. So if I knew more about this company, if they had a specific marking they used on everything to tag it as internal, I could just plug that in and get even more filtered results. But you can just read in the results, proprietary and confidential. This document contains confidential information, no disclosure, duplication, whatever. So were these intentionally disclosed? I don't know. It sure doesn't feel like it. And it especially didn't feel like it with this example. So this was a different .gov domain I pointed to where I got a little more specific because I know a little bit more about how this particular organization runs. So I said in text, show me case numbers in spreadsheets. And again, I'm taken to a SharePoint site. So this SharePoint issue presents itself once again. And clicking into, despite the fact that it says PDFs in the link, this is a spreadsheet. It's tagged as XLS by Google. When I click into it, this particular spreadsheet had on every single, you can see I'm pretty deep in there. I'm on column AO. On every single row, it had a unique email, first name, last name combo, and address for an individual associated with a particular case type. And there were just shy of 10,000 of these rows, about 9,000. So that's 30,000 unique first name, last name, address, and email combos. Now, was this intentionally released? It sure didn't feel like it, but maybe. And it's probably not a good look to have something like this sitting out in the public. My best guess, usually the case for things like this is they're sharing this data with a sister agency, they're sharing this data with a consultant, and because they're not linked to their identity infrastructure in any way, they share via URL. And even when you try to narrow that down, it doesn't always work quite how you think it should. So this SharePoint file, and I didn't even look at the other ones, who the hell knows what was in them, was incredibly juicy right out of the gate. So in terms of the adversarial value of a public document, the contents are obvious, right? Potentially passive collection of internal data and compromising data exposed via collaboration software. And in every example I showed you, collaboration software or internal misconfigurations. Now, the reason I say potentially passive is because when you used to run a Google Dork and download a bunch of documents from a company's website, you'd be cutting logs on a web server. Now, these files are hosted somewhere else. With the rapid adoption of SaaS you're cutting logs somewhere that they are probably not going to this enterprise's SIEM. So while it's not actually passive in that you are cutting logs somewhere, you're probably not cutting logs somewhere that the organization has access to. In the case of SharePoint, maybe, and maybe the logs can be requested, but what you're doing, dorking already on a corporate domain, it looks like normal activity. It's normal web server activity. It's not going to be hitting any like advanced UEBA alerts or triggering much on the WAF if you're just downloading files, right? It looks pretty normal. And now you're even one step removed from the complexity there. And the last content value I have there is wireless ransom. Now, this is not common. It's something that I think could be more common, but in all the documents I showed you, these are potentially things that would have been interesting finds during an internal red team, depending on the scope of what I'm looking for. I am finding, we're finding files through these dorks that previously, before the adoption of these cloud services and the exposure via public URLs, would have taken phishing, initial access, privilege escalation, phishing, a location of the SharePoint server, pulling down the files, seeing what's interesting. I have now done through like 2 clicks. So what a lot of ransomware actors do these days, you see in their campaigns, is they'll not only say, we've got everything, pay us, and we'll decrypt all the hosts, but also, if you don't do it by X time, we've exfiltrated a lot too, we'll start releasing it. Now, without having to compromise an organization in a way that, again, cuts any logs, you can say, I found this super confidential spreadsheet about your upcoming merger, pay me or I release it. So without actual compromise, you can take content for ransom via its exposure, which is something you could always do, but it's become significantly easier with the rapid adoption of cloud services hosting files. This is just another example of that value in action. So the bottom example is the contents. I've cut no logs, and I'm looking at a spreadsheet of 30,000 unique contacts, unique emails, and they were not emails for that entity, they were people's emails. 30,000 unique records, the content, the value of that is obvious. Now with the metadata, I've got in this PDF above that I pulled from a similar entity, I've got pscript5.dll, so I've got a possible DLL to hijack. I've got the specific name of a DLL here. I've got software versions known to be running on the host. I've got some kind of IDP associated username, both in the creator field and in the author field. This is a PDF, but I see that it was created with Microsoft Word from the title of the file. So I'm getting a pretty good idea again, and I've also got an OS version in the producer field. I've got OSX, 10.4.6 quartz, and then the utility used to create the PDF from Word, which was PDF context. So again, I'm putting together, the more documents I have, the more confidently I can put together this inventory of internal, runnings and usernames for stuffing portals that don't accept emails. You can easily pull emails with like 100.io, but where are you going to pull internal creds from? And it's these files in many cases. So how do you prevent and detect this? So prevention is stupidly easy in the most common applications, but it's not as simple to implement for the business, right? Like the folks in infrastructure and the folks on the business side might be pretty resistant to eliminating this because this is a really common way to share files in a totally safe way with other people. It's just the capability itself can be misused, in a way that's super dramatic and super unfortunate. On SharePoint and OneDrive, it is as easy as sliding a little slider down to least permissive. And on G Suite, excuse me, it's as easy as clicking the off button on link sharing. These are both in like the admin tenants. That's where you do it. Now you can also get a little more specific. Maybe you don't want to disable link sharing. You can disable link sharing to anyone who's not in our identity infrastructure. So you can get a little more granular and still allow link sharing, but in a safer way. But documents, in many, many cases, when shared via URL from G Suite, SharePoint, or OneDrive, once that URL exists, it will be indexed, especially if you're like in Chrome. I'm trying to figure out all the scenarios. I'll put together a blog on all the specific scenarios that make the URL indexed by Google, but there's a hell of a lot of them. So when you make when you make a file shareable via URL, it will be indexed by a search engine in most cases, and now that is searchable by the right person with the right dork. Now, the prevention of metadata, if you've already got a ton of files out there and you put stuff out that's super useful and a part of normal business practice for you, You can strip the properties using like, the right click in Windows, go to properties, clear metadata. That does not clear most of the interesting stuff. So this is the only method that I advocate for, which is using the EXIF tool utility minus all equals file name. With that argument, we see on the left, I have my file as I originally pulled it. We've got that DLL. We've got all that, the usernames in it. Once I run the EXIF tool minus all, it pulls all of that interesting stuff out. Now, I've heard of ways to, still retrieve that information, but most people aren't doing that. So this is a safe way that I endorse to strip metadata out of a file before sharing it if you do have to share files publicly, which now, you should just put the information on a web page. But if you still need to share a file, you can do it safely. And a super simple detection pipeline that anyone can do, you can do this on a box, you can throw this into a Lambda. If you run a tool like PyMeta, to download all your files, on a cron job, and then have a super simple script in Bash or Python or whatever to look at the metadata in all the files your org has out there. Are we accidentally exposing the author field, the creator field? Are we exposing internal software packages? And then also grep the file's contents for keywords that you're interested in, like our specific tagging for confidential or our merger coming up. And especially if you've got something like your merger coming up, run this search with those same keywords against, like this is public domain stuff, run it against everyone involved in the merger, the two consultancies, the law firm, the mergee, and see if they're not accidentally exposing files, about the merger coming up. These are things in the public domain. You are legally allowed to be searching that, especially if it's a merger you're involved in. But it's super easy to run this against yourself and run it against whoever else you want, who might have this information and might be accidentally leaking it. And then, through an API, send that alert wherever it suits you. Now, why does this matter? A lot of us know about metadata already, know about Google Dorks. The reason is the landscape for Dorks has changed quite a bit. With the mass adoption of collaboration software and the switch to SaaS-hosted infrastructure, not a lot of file sharing things are on-prem anymore, which is the way of the future. It's something I advocate for, of course. The amount of exposed files has increased dramatically over the last 2 to 4 years. There's several reasons for that I link here. Most of the vendors who are doing your the scraping that you would hope would be pulling these are not. So the changes in the public landscape, that's the reason why these things are still sitting out there in such huge numbers. And this is the final note I'll end on, but this is 2007 beloved child's character Bob the Builder seeing a document. So this is a document profile. These are all files I pulled from a domain a couple days ago. Up at the top are files linked directly to the corporate domain, right? These are files that were intentionally released by the company. Totally manageable job for Bob the Builder. We can handle this. This is like 6 files. Now, everything else you see below that this is 2022 Bob the Builder. It's no longer 2007. We're using collaboration software. Those are all files hosted by third-party services, now exposed and associated with this same corporate domain. So obviously now we are swimming in a river of Bob the Builder's tears. And that is the ostensible end of this presentation, but I hate to end on such a somber note, and I'd like to enforce that this is a solvable problem, right? Like link sharing, finding these files, it is solvable. It is a little bit chaotic right now and a bit endemic in the sheer volume of exposed files, but it is most definitely a solvable problem. So that's it. That's my presentation. I appreciate you guys coming, and I think we have a little bit of time for questions.
I've been doing this for a long while because I'm a SharePoint guy. That's what I've been doing for the last 14 years. VIEWLSTS is the part of the URL to view all lists.
Mm-hmm.
And if you search on that and FOUO, there are a lot of good things you can find just right now. The other thing that I did, one thing the agency I worked for at the time, that they
Nice.
and he was walked out by 2 people.
Well, that's unfortunate, but a great example of the actual consequences of metadata leakage. And yeah, file history is stored in a lot of file types. The usernames of the people involved, the timestamps, all that stuff. So very cool. And sorry that happened. Any other questions in the back? Sure. Yeah, I can share the slides somehow. You got it. Yes.
How often do you think organizations are even aware of this?
In my like notifications, you know, almost never. I think only sort of now are companies starting to kind of be like, hey, what's on the outside? Like what can, but, and kind of rightfully so, like the priorities have been, you know, let's roll out EDR, let's make sure all of our internal detections are looking good. Only now are people sort of having the time and the space to be like, okay, well, wait, if we're looking specifically just from what the average adversary is looking from, like credentialed from the uncredentialed from the outside, what can they see? So in most cases, not aware at all. Like if I'm showing them something that I found here, it's the first time they've seen it. But I do think that's changing. I'm hopeful that that's changing at least. There was another question? Yes.
How often, or have you done any research into finding malware campaigns?
Yeah, that's a great idea. I haven't. I'm usually looking for corporate-owned files, but in the juicy, I mean, ExploitDB has tons of searches for file types or contents within file types. So you could totally look for, with cool dorks, look for malware samples hosted on domains. Like look for open directories that are hosting EXEs or something facing the internet. So that's a good idea. And I have not done it, but totally something to do. All right, I think I have to make room for the next speaker, so thank you all so much. Thank you. Much obliged.